Welcome to NovaraLIVE. Coming up tonight, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is at the centre of a storm after it was revealed that Peter Mandelson was appointed US ambassador despite failing his security vetting. We ask, is this the last straw for the centrist dads? Iran has opened the Strait of Hormuz. Donald Trump has publicly told Benjamin Netanyahu he is prohibited from bombing Lebanon anymore. And there are just two little words from EU foreign spokesperson Kaja Kallas that she can't seem to say. I'm Helena, otherwise known as No Justice MTG, and tonight, very, very happy to be joined by Stephen Methven. Stephen, how are you this Friday?
I'm very good, Helena. It's been a day of shenanigans at home, shenanigans abroad, and I think we're going to cover it all this evening.
It's true. It's been a real mission getting all these things together as new information's been coming into the studio all day.
In a constant stream, yeah.
Absolutely. So very much looking forward to untangling the webs that we've been weaving so far this afternoon. And if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. You can also listen to the show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And as always, please make sure that you let us know what you think in the comments section down below. Could this be the beginning of the end for Keir Starmer? Yesterday, The Guardian dropped a bombshell revelation around the appointment of Peter Mandelson as US ambassador, that the Foreign Office overruled security vetting after Mandelson failed the procedure to make sure he could take up his post. The devastating report by their political editor, Pippa alleges that she had been informed by multiple sources that initial developed vetting had denied Mandelson clearance in January 2025, having been appointed by number 10 to the post in December 2024. It is also being reported by Crerar that the Prime Minister was only informed of the fact that Mandelson failed the vetting process this week, alongside then Foreign Secretary David Lammy, the minister responsible for the office that overruled the vetting at the time of Mandelson's appointment. Crerar also alleges that current Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper also only became aware of these revelations this week when approached by The Guardian over the story yesterday. If all of this is true, then officials in the Foreign Office who knew about the failed vetting kept the three most influential government ministers in the dark about the facts, even whilst the Mandelson scandal was consuming parliamentary discourse for weeks on end. Now, here's a reminder of what Keir Starmer said about this in the House of Commons.
Mr. Speaker, as she and the House would expect, full due process was followed during this appointment, as it is with all ambassadors. The ambassador has repeatedly expressed his deep regret. He is right to do so. He's now playing an important part in the US-UK relationship. Mr. Speaker, as I say, full due process was gone through in relation to this appointment, as would be expected. Well, Mr. Speaker, as I've made clear to the House, a full due process was gone through when the appointment was made.
Okay, so the narrative here that we're going with is that at no point did anyone in the FCDO think that it might have been worth mentioning to the PM that there was even a potential that due process might not have been followed whilst this was in the media headlines. There's also this from political editor of The Independent, David Maddox. I don't normally publish conversations with Downing Street, but this was my initial exchange with Downing Street's then Director of Communications over Mandelson failing vetting on the 11th of September last year. Hi Tim, I've been told by two sources now that Mandelson in fact did not clear vetting with MI6, but the PM pushed his appointment anyway. The problem was China, not Epstein though. Is there any comment on this, David? And the response, vetting done by FCDO in the normal way. So now the potential that Mandelson failed vetting was also known to the Downing Street Director of Communications, having been questioned by a journalist, and even they didn't inform the Prime Minister or any foreign ministers? Well, here's what Starmer had to say for himself today when questioned by Sky News' Sam Coates in Paris.
That I wasn't told that it failed security vetting when I was telling Parliament that due process had been followed is unforgivable. Not only was I not told, no minister was told. And I'm absolutely furious about that. What I intend to do is to go to Parliament on Monday to set out all the relevant facts in true transparency so Parliament has the full picture.
Prime Minister, why do you always end up sounding like the passenger in this government rather than the driver? Are you really expecting us to believe that a senior civil servant off his own back, without any sort of direction about the importance of Peter Mandelson being ambassador, unilaterally overruled security vetting to approve a political appointment, and they made clear it was political?
I was not told that he had failed security vetting. No minister was told that he had failed security vetting. Number 10 wasn't told that he had failed security vetting. That is completely unacceptable. That is why I intend to go to Parliament and set out all of the relevant facts so Parliament has full transparency and full accountability. It is totally unacceptable that the Prime Minister making an appointment is not told that security vetting has been failed. Totally unacceptable.
You're almost 2 years in post. Doesn't this just sound like you don't have a grip on your government?
I was not told that security vetting had failed. That is shocking, it is unacceptable, and I intend to set out the full facts to Parliament on Monday.
The T101 there stuck on repeats about the fact that he's furious about the fact he wasn't told about the vetting. Well, we're now joined by Paul Holden, investigative journalist and author of The Fraud, Keir Starmer, Morgan McSweeney, and The Crisis of British Democracy. Paul, welcome to the show. Just in time for a new crisis in British democracy. I mean, I'll start with a simple question. Of course, like we're all well aware of what things are like in Number 10. Does any of this surprise you?
No, not at all. I mean, this is par for the course because this is a Labour project that has repeatedly always seems to have an incredible ability to make the wrong choices all the time. And I think the broader context here, I think, is really this is a process story that's been happening for the last day or so, and lots of people will be trying to figure out exactly who knew what when, and who conducted security clearance. But really, the fundamental big story that most of the public is seeing, I think, is actually pretty straightforward. Is that there's a pretty notorious guy, Peter Mandelson, who pretty much most people on the internet knew had some sort of relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, was appointed the US ambassador. We've already known weeks ago that a due diligence report was done prior to the national vetting thing, which raised this as an issue. And Keir Starmer didn't think it was sufficient to stop him being appointed. And of course, now the scandal drags on and on and on, and it'll drag on and on and on practically because Keir Starmer is still Prime Minister, and Keir Starmer appointed this person when it's plain to anybody with half a brain that he shouldn't have been appointed. And, we have this Westminster mill, which goes over precisely who knew what when, and there's denials and there's briefings and there's raw intelligence and there's all sorts of letters that get exchanged. But fundamentally, at the bottom of it, this is an appointment that anybody who was outside of Number 10 must have known was a terrible idea and it was indefensible, and they're still trying to defend the indefensible. And as they do so, the story will continue running.
Yeah, it just seemed to be like got himself in a bit of a pickle, doesn't it there, Stephen?
Yeah, absolutely. Paul, I just wanted to ask you another question about the political sense of Keir Starmer here, because it sort of goes to something that you just said. But, if I was in Starmer's position, knowing Mandelson, and someone had come to me and said, oh, he's passed his security vetting, I think I would have said, really, shall we just double check? Are you sure? Can we just really belt and brace this? Doesn't it show a kind of lack of just like basic political sense not to have made absolutely sure that when he was told that he'd passed, that it was in fact properly done? Because that would have been what I would have thought if someone had told me Mandelson, with the things that we know about him and his connections, had just passed sort of this high-level security vetting to become the ambassador to the US.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting watching that clip where Starmer is saying, I wasn't told, I was kept in the dark, pretty much in the same way that when he was confronted with the due diligence exercise and Peter Mandelson, according to him, gave him misleading answers. He said, I can't believe Peter Mandelson lied to me. It's like, well, I think most people would expect slightly more from a KC, who is the former director of public prosecutions, that you'd be on top of this stuff. Now, when he says, I wasn't told, what I hear is, well, you didn't ask. You're the Prime Minister. If you'd asked the right question, you would have gotten the right answer. You didn't ask the right question, so you didn't have the answer. And, I've been following, in a sort of very nerdish way, the actual mill over today about what has been said when. Something that hasn't been focused on at all, and I was just reading it as we were coming onto the call, is this letter that's exchanged between Ollie Robinson and Yvette Cooper and Emily Thornberry. This was back in September 2025, right? And this is the same time that you have the political editor of The Independent who sent in a text message to Tim Allen saying, I've heard this about the security vetting. And actually, if you go and read this letter, which is actually a very interesting exchange between Emily Thornberry is asking directly, were there security concerns raised in relation to the vetting? And they basically followed off from this, and we're not going to give an answer to that. But from September 2025, it's clear people are asking questions. The only person who is not asking that question is Keir Starmer. Now, I think that's just, generally speaking, so reflective of him as an individual who doesn't seem to be particularly minded to get on top of the details of government. He seems like weirdly confused by the systems that he oversees and operates. I also think it's because for basically the majority of his political career, he's outsourced everything to Morgan McSweeney, literally everything. His thinking, his strategy, the dirty work of becoming prime minister. He's basically said to him, this is your issue. This was your guy. You manage it. And he didn't bother. And as a result, we're going to have this endless drip stuff coming out of the humble address motion. There's going to be relentless briefing from inside, all because, first of all, the Labour Party is so hollowed out of talent at this point that nobody could launch a leadership challenge against a guy who should have been gone months ago, back in September 2025. But also who's been, a process he's never seemed to understand or get to the grips of. I mean, it's an absolutely astonishing situation where you're actually having a prime minister say, I don't know what's happening in my own government, and that's my defense. It's astonishing.
I mean, that's the thing, right? Is that even outside of all of this, we knew Keir Starmer wasn't political. He wasn't interested really in policy or politics, according to a really interesting Tim Shipman article from a couple of months back. But one of the things that you kind of could expect from Keir Starmer is his lawyerly brain to kick in, the adherence to process, the technocracy of going, make sure I have all of the facts, then come to a conclusion. Yet in this case, it's gone out the window. All of that approach to adhering to process just seemed to have evaporated. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think, generally speaking, I think this is an entire project that is grounded in repeated dishonesty and misdirection, in which Keir Starmer has shown himself to be utterly cavalier about the lawfulness of the people, or the conduct of the people around him. This is clear. I know I bang on about this endlessly, and people probably are getting quite tired of hearing it. But Morgan McSweeney broke the law for 2.5 years. He didn't report donations to the Electoral Commission for 2.5 years between 2018 and 2020. And some of that money was used to ensure that Keir Starmer was made leader of the Labour Party. Now, explain to me how somebody who cares about process and the law says, you know what, this guy who broke the law, either because he's incompetent or because he chose to do so, I think he's so profoundly incompetent, he doesn't know how to fill in a form after being told how to do so by the Electoral Commission, or he doesn't care to do so, should be my chief of staff. That he should actually be in such a powerful position that he's going to be given security clearance and develop vetting and sit in meetings with the most powerful people in the world, learning about troop movements and where our nuclear weapons are based. This is basic stuff. I don't think he really cares. I don't think he's really applied his mind to the nature of the people around him. Because if he did apply his mind to the nature of the people around him, like most people who've investigated them, they're horrified. Because these are people who don't seem to care about the law, because if they cared about the law, they'd follow it. And if they cared about decency and basic respect for the law and just being decent human beings, they wouldn't be friends with Peter Mandelson. I mean, right? This is pretty simple stuff.
I mean, the thing is, in that clip that we saw from Sam Coates there, he was like, well, you're more of a passenger in what's going on here, aren't you? In the pasture in this government, which reminds me of that quote, the very famous quote about Starmer from his own advisors saying, well, we've sat him at the front of the DLR thing, making him think that he's in charge. And it does look again, you say he's not applied himself. Yeah, well, he's not the one, ultimately, from what we know, who's making many of the decisions, right? What we're going to do is going to cover a bit. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Paul.
I was just going to say, I was just thinking about that analogy today, because actually I think we need to extend that analogy. Because it's not just that he thinks he's in the train and he thinks that he's driving it. If we follow his logic now, it doesn't even seem to know that he's in a train. He doesn't actually seem to know what the vehicle is that he's in. He doesn't seem to know anything about the decisions that he makes. It's astonishing.
It is absolutely astonishing. But what we're going to do is going to cover a bit more of the story, and then obviously we'll come back to you, Paul, about some of those facts. Now, one thing mentioned by Sam Coates to the Prime Minister in the clip we showed before is that the line coming from number 10 is that it's a Foreign Office official who has held the information around the vetting procedure from ministers. So who is it? The man at the centre of the maelstrom is the now former Permanent Secretary in the Foreign Office, Ollie Robbins. I say former, as he was summarily removed from post late last night by number 10. It is he who was tasked with the security clearance for Peter Mandelson in this case, and it's the government's position that he personally held the information around the vetting outcome from ministers. But is this true? Well, first of all, it is worth explaining how the vetting process works. Developed vetting, as it is known, involves independent security vetting services, that's UKSV for short, presenting information to the Foreign Office or certain Foreign Office officials regarding a potential appointment security risks. According to ex-National Cybersecurity Centre boss Kieran Martin, when speaking with Sam Coates, it is then the decision of the Foreign Office official in charge to decide whether or not to pass or fail the individual in question. In this case, it falls with the Permanent Secretary Ollie Robbins as mentioned. However, also according to Martin, it is only the job of the UKSV to present the information to the Foreign Office and not make a recommendation as such, therefore leaving the sole decision around whether or not to pass or to fail with Robbins in this case, who is also apparently not supposed to share the details of the vetting process with ministers to protect sensitive information obtained by the process from leaking. So this does add some authenticity to the claims that ministers were unaware until this week, due to the nature of the vetting procedure. What this now calls into question is that if this is all correct, on what grounds have the government sacked Robbins? It's been reported that allies and even enemies of Robbins within the civil service are furious over the reaction from Number 10. It is worth pointing out too that questions around Mandelson's vetting were reported in the I-Paper last year by Richard Holmes and Kitty Donaldson. Holmes has also waded into the discourse today regarding the appointment. It is definitely the case that political pressure, implicit or explicit, can be put on the vetting process, and those involved are only human and vulnerable to it, an official said. You would have to be a courageous official to tell Number 10 there were complications with the vetting unless it was really black and white. That is not a quote from today, but from February, when Kitty Donaldson and I revealed that Foreign Office officials were asked to complete Mandelson's security screening as quickly as possible to get him in post. Correct. Security services can only make recommendations. Officials then make decisions. If UKSV raise concerns about individual mitigations can be made about the person's access. We don't know yet if that happened with Mandelson. The Foreign Office decision to clear him came under immense and well-documented pressure from Number 10. Simply framing this as a rogue civil servant's mistake is wrong. Further illuminating this issue is this response from Robbins himself when he was asked by the Foreign Affairs Select Committee about the suitability of Mandelson's appointment.
By the time we're describing, it was clear that the Prime Minister wanted to make this appointment himself and had, therefore, I understand that the FCDO was informed of his decision and acted upon it, and via the Foreign Secretary sought and obtained the King's approval for the appointment. But we were, in this particular case, as Chris has explained, the Prime Minister took advice and then formed a view himself, and we then acted on that view.
So I'm just going to bring you back in, Paul. So if we are aware of this, the Foreign Office knew that Number 10 were keen on this appointment and asked to facilitate it. And according to Alva Rea from The New Statesman, Number 10 had already been made aware of Mandelson's links to Epstein and Russia before pressing on with the vetting process. Who's in the right here?
I mean, we don't know. That's a really important thing to say, is that like right now, I hate to use an intelligence phrase, but like we're in the raw intelligence stage of proceedings where you just have like lots of information, lots of people making different claims. I mean, Ollie Robinson himself hasn't spoken about something. There's somebody who's sort of speaking on his behalf in the public domain and sort of leading this idea that maybe he was the person who made that decision. I mean, he's going to appear before the Foreign Office on Tuesday. What is absolutely clear, like this is a political appointment. And I think this is an important thing to bear in mind about the whole process, right? Which is that generally speaking, in ambassadorial appointments, you have there is a foreign diplomatic corps that appoints people from its own ranks, and it's quite rare. It's actually incredibly unusual for that sort of diplomatic process to be overridden and a political appointment is made, which is basically where the Prime Minister says, "I've made a different decision to the diplomatic corps, which has expertise here," and that's what happened here. So this is the first time since 1977. That a political decision was made by the Prime Minister around a US ambassadorial appointment. At the same time, it should be pointed out, one of the things that always gets lost in this is that the White House was saying during this appointment process, we actually quite like the person who's currently in post. We don't particularly like Peter Mandelson. And there was an outrider from the White House who came out and said, we think Peter Mandelson's an idiot, effectively, because Peter Mandelson had criticized Donald Trump before. So there's an enormous, first of all, this is their decision. They were the ones who put this guy up. The first vetting process that happens is the due diligence process that happens in Keir Starmer, when it comes to Keir Starmer through the Cabinet Office. And that is very clear that we now have that due diligence document. It's been released as part of the humble address. It says very clearly, he was told about the Financial Times article that said that Peter Mandelson had stayed at Jeffrey Epstein's flat after or during the period of time or thereafter when Jeffrey Epstein had been imprisoned for soliciting prostitution from a minor, who's basically soliciting the rape of a minor. Explain to me how, at that point, even regardless of what Peter Mandelson might have said to you to try and defray that very hard black and white reporting, you thought that this guy was an appropriate person to put into post. Let's also bear in mind that at this entire time, Peter Mandelson, who's been forced to resign multiple times from cabinet, was also a shareholder and director of Global Counsel, which was lobbying on behalf of a whole range of multinational companies, including Palantir. Now, this is really basic governance stuff. Like, it really is basic governance stuff about this guy. Even outside of the Epstein stuff, this guy can't be in a room where he's accessing the most important national security secrets. Everybody can tell that. This is plainly a political decision. They've chosen this person. They forced him through, even though when it's announced, everybody is saying, this is a bit crazy. This doesn't make any sense. And now we know that from at least September 2025, there were multiple questions going in to number 10, and to Yvette Cooper, and to Oliver Robbins, saying, we understand that he didn't actually pass the security vetting, or at least there were issues with it. Please explain. And now 6 months later, we're still sifting through like the entrails of this totally rotten, zombified beast, which is the appointment of the best friend or a very good friend of like the world's most notorious pedophile.
Yeah.
This is a crazy position to be in.
It is a crazy position. And I'm just wondering, like, why it is you think that Starmer got himself into this position. I mean, like, look, what's obviously become clear is that he is far from the brightest button in the box, but even small children can do cost-benefit assessments. The cost here is so obviously high, as you've pointed out. What possible benefits could he have imagined were going to outweigh these costs when he thought it through at even a minimal level?
Well, first of all, again, it's not so clear to me that Starmer is the person who's making these sort of key decisions. I think he deferred a lot of the stuff to Morgan McSweeney. And we now know, I mean, it's been frustrating because my book's already out. There's been so much new information about the scope and the depth of the friendship between Peter Mandelson and Morgan McSweeney that I didn't know about when I wrote about the book, which has made me rethink this project quite fundamentally, right? Because it does seem like Mandelson was more than like a passing acquaintance of this project, that he was a very deep and profound participant in this project and was working very closely with Morgan McSweeney. And I think one of the things I try to pull out in the book is that after the Labour Party comes into government, and actually before Labour Party comes into government, you can see this a little bit with the freebies stuff. You see, Keir Starmer and all these people in the year before he comes into power are making terrible governance decisions because Keir Starmer is taking freebies from football from football clubs, from gambling firms, from all sorts of people who's going to absolutely conflict him when he's in government. It's a terrible thing to be doing before you come into government, right? And I really do think we need to understand the period after 2024 as effectively a period in which you bed in the new Labour government, but you also enact a patronage network. This is the moment where you have insiders who, for 3, 4, 5, maybe 10 years, have first of all worked to destroy Corbynism as a precondition of your, this project's success, and then have remade and remade this party in a fundamental way. And when the Labour Party comes into power, this is the moment where this project rewards the people who've helped to install it. So it's not just Peter Mandelson. Obviously, Peter Mandelson is like the most grotesque example of it because anybody with half a brain can see this guy shouldn't be appointed to the position that he's appointed to. But this happens throughout the party at like a really pretty fundamental level. So you have all these party bureaucrats who are either appointed into like pretty senior positions in government or going to lobbying firms, right? And that's because this is both a political project and a patronage machine, which is about sort of wielding the power of the state to reward those people who've secured its power and who they think will be canny enough to use their power to maximize the future patronage potential of this project. I think that's the fundamental issue here. And really, I think people expect Keir Starmer to be somebody because he's DPP, because he's a KC, because he comes across as like a decent person. He's like the ultimate, you couldn't imagine somebody more out of like Polly Toynbee's imagination of like central casting of what a Labour leader should be, right? And the reality is, if you actually look at his record, both before he becomes Prime Minister and thereafter, is that he's got like serious governance issues, serious, like basic basic conflict of interest stuff, right? And I remember I did a video for Double Down News back in, before he was elected, and I was screaming. I was telling journalists repeatedly, this guy has taken more freebies than every Labour leader since Tony Blair combined. He has already conflicted himself before he comes into government. He is not applying his mind to what good governance looks like. And it's in that context that an appointment like Peter Mandelson can happen.
I mean, the thing as well with these people is that from especially reading your book and understanding the history of how we got to this position in the first place with people being in charge, is that they looked very Machiavellian. They looked like this huge plan. It was incredibly detailed and calculated up to this point. And yet what we've seen in terms of the Mandelson appointment is a huge amount of hubris going into the ways in which this is all blown up in their faces. I mean, partially, it looks to me due to complete incompetence. Do you think they just kind of felt untouchable and that none of this would blow up in their face? How do you think we got here?
Well, they were untouchable. I mean, I think that's the point. And I think it's one of the points that I try to make in the book is that for a long time, they were untouchable. Nobody scrutinized them properly before they came into government, outside of basically you guys. It was No Justice MTG and Novara and Owen Jones and Open Democracy, which I think did great reporting on sort of the pre-election period, who were saying this project is very problematic from all sorts of different perspectives, but they weren't scrutinized in any sort of meaningful way. And it is quite astonishing the extent to which they weren't scrutinized. So to give you, a very concrete example that I use in the book is the freebies thing, right? Which is one of the defining things that happens immediately after Starmer is elected, is that, they cut the winter fuel allowance and then you have freebies. And those two things, you almost can't recover from those two things happening at the same time in terms of public opinion. But it's not like the freebie stuff wasn't known and discoverable. It's on his register of interests. You can search for it. It's easy to search for it. The only mainstream media outlet that mentioned the freebies was the Financial Times the day before the vote in the general election. On the 3rd of July is the first time a mainstream media outlet reports on the freebies stuff. So for a long period of time, these people weren't scrutinized. And the function, I've been telling this to I've been speaking to Neil Lawson about this and to sort of people still in the Labour Party or in Compass or a mainstream. It's one of the functions of this political project is they didn't fight democratically, right? They didn't win arguments internally. They didn't win arguments on the strength of their ideas or the plans that they had for government. They won through mischief, through misdirection, through illegality, and through bureaucratic shenanigans. Basically through brute force achieved through a bureaucratic system. This is very explicit. Like I said, I said in another interview, they won power like Trotskyists and they ruled like Leninists. Right?
I mean, yeah. It is not unsurprising that they would have wanted the extra services of a man known as the Prince of Darkness, right?
I mean, absolutely. I did try to write an article for The Independent, I think it was, where I tried to call Morgan McSweeney the Prince Ling of Darkness. They didn't take it. But I think, the way I now understand this project is not just that it's a McSweeney Labour Together Starmer project, but it's also a Labour Together Morgan McSweeney Mandelson project. And it's Mandelsonian in its methodology, and it's been Mandelsonian in its methodology since 2017, where it used really despicable, genuinely despicable dirty tricks to win power and to secure power for these people. And it's been astonishing to me the extent to which these people, as a result, the result of this process is, A, they weren't scrutinized. So they're not used to scrutiny. So they act recklessly when they're in power, and they act recklessly all the time. But also, they're not tested internally, right? They're not subject to a process of, when you have a functioning Democratic Party where people are elected and selected because they are the best candidates through a free and democratic process, the best people emerge, the most competent people emerge. It's striking to me that somebody like Jamie Driscoll, for example, who I think is extremely competent, is too competent for the Labour Party. I mean, that's the fundamental issue. You look at somebody like Jamie Driscoll, who wasn't allowed to stand as a Labour candidate for Newcastle Mayor, I think is now pretty much on track with, if you look at the polling, to become the leader of the Newcastle Council because the Greens are polling so well there. And the fundamental problem they had with him is that he's too competent. He was too good at his job, right? And this is not just about a tall poppy syndrome where they cut down the best people amongst them. Faiza Shaheen is another good example. Somebody who plainly should be in Parliament. That most political parties would be begging to have somebody of her caliber and her competence and her quality in government. And that was a threat to this political project. And that says everything you need to know about it. is that it's not competent. And its incompetence was hidden from us because it wasn't scrutinized.
I know, but Peter Mandelson and the MP for Runcorn and Helsby and Andrew Gwynn, they're all the highest quality candidates, of course. Anyway, we're going to look at some of the political reaction now. Naturally, given Keir Starmer's precarity as Prime Minister, many have been calling for his resignation, depending on the outcome of any investigation into what went wrong. Here's Liberal Democrat leader Ed Davey.
Well, if the Prime Minister has misled Parliament and the public about this, he will have to go. We already know he showed catastrophic political misjudgment in appointing Mandelson to be the UK's ambassador to America. He was relying on the vetting process as his defence. It's looked like the vetting process was ignored. This is hugely serious, and I think he will probably have to go. This reminds me of the Conservatives and the scandals around them. Labour promised to clean our politics up, and now they're just as bad as the Conservatives.
On the subject of the Conservatives, here's also Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch.
Despite it being known that his appointment would pose a risk to national security, somehow he was appointed anyway. Someone pushed that appointment through. The Prime Minister is now asking us to believe that no one in government thought to tell him or his team that Mandelson had failed vetting, that the first he heard about it was on Tuesday night. This is preposterous. He is taking the public for fools. We know that Number 10 was told that Mandelson had failed his vetting because journalists told them in September last year. This leaves us with two possibilities. Either the Prime Minister is lying, or he is so incompetent that he is unfit to run the country. Either way, his position is untenable.
On top of both of these, Green Party leader Zach Polanski, Plaid Cymru leader in Westminster Liz Saville-Roberts, as well as their party leader, I've become to learn, Rhina Pureweth, have also called for the PM to resign as well. Although I must say, I personally find the SNP Stephen Flynn to have put it the most succinctly. The Prime Minister is either incompetent, gullible, or a liar, or all three. Paul, finally, before you do go, is it time? Is it now time that Keir Starmer will have to go?
I mean, there was time in September 2025, right? His time has long been up. And the issue, I mean, it doesn't seem like he has it within him to resign. I think there's something about his personality, which means that he will almost certainly not resign of his own volition and he'll have to be deposed. And the problem that the party has, and the reason why we have this lame duck prime minister, is because this political project has been so successful. Because this political project has denuded cabinet of any sort of major talent. There's nobody in cabinet who the public particularly likes, who seems to have any vision for how to run the country. The great hope is the mayor of Manchester, who's not even an MP, and there's no sort of clear path to how you can become MP. So if this was a normal political project in a sort of half-functioning government, he would have already been gone, because there would have been a range of talented people around him who the public have chosen on the strength of their ideas and personalities that could replace him. But there's not. There's Wes Streeting and Yvette Cooper and Shabana Mahmood and Bridget Phillipson, who I don't think any member of the public is particularly enthused by. So my sense is that he should have been gone a long time ago. My deep sense, my actual instinct, is that he's likely to not go for a while, because there's nobody to replace him. And the processes that need to play out to replace him are going to take a long time. I think it is not implausible that he is Prime Minister at the end of this year, remarkably, even in light of what I think is going to be devastating local election results, even in his own constituency, where the Greens are polling very well. I think it's high time for this whole political project to deflate and to evaporate, and for them all to post, sufficient online apologies for how they've ruined our politics for the last decade. That's not going to happen anytime soon.
Well, the thing as well is that the party machinery has been neutered so much as a deliberate move within this project, right? The party machinery has been changed to ensure that the MPs were selected specifically so they would be loyal to the Starmer project. We've had internal staff at Labour HQ to essentially excise people who would be anyone standing in the way of the Starmer project from the beginning. As you say, it seems difficult to see how, if Keir Starmer wants to stay on, that they would be able to get rid of him.
Well, you look at the current intake, right? So, and I should say, this is my partner Jess has been doing some really interesting work on this, and we've been working on a project that hopefully will become a second book, building what we've done before. And you look at the actual number of MPs at Labour Party, just over 400. The new intake, as in people who are selected under the Morgan McSweeney Mandelson project, is about 250. Right? There's only 150 of the original sort of Labour intake that's there. This is all new intake. This is all Morgan McSweeney, Peter Mandelson's group of people who have been, a lot of them who don't have a huge amount of political experience and who have been selected on the basis of loyalty. And I should also point out, have actually voted very loyally on sort of key issues that the other rump of extant Labour MPs have been slightly more cautious about, things like jury trial and things like the prescribing of Palestine action. So I can't see, if Starmer wants to survive and he wants to hang on, I'm not sure that there's, the number of MPs you'd need to trigger a vote of no confidence in him. It's also not clear to me, because of the way the Morgan McSweeney and Luke Akers and others stitched up the leadership process, that it would even be possible for a half-decent candidate to emerge organically from the party. And I think the last thing that people really haven't been paying attention to, I did an article, it was a front page article with the Times probably about 2 or 3 months ago, about the level of Labour Party membership, which is now sitting at around, I think, 250,000, if I remember correctly, which is half of what it was under Jeremy Corbyn. This is a poor party now, right? A lot of donors have left it. There's a handful of sort of key Labour Together affiliated donors who are still keeping it afloat. But this is not the same party as it was in 2023 and 2024. Other thing to bear in mind is that if these local elections go the way we think, currently the army of activists that the Labour Party have is pretty much exclusively its councillors, because grassroots members don't go out and campaign anymore. This is a party that's sort of organically withering as a result of this project. It's losing membership, it's losing income, it's losing public credibility. And it's hard to see how this machine that has been built up to not be democratic can produce like a reasonable democratic outcome that survives, that brings this Labour Party back into some sort of vaguely plausible electoral shape. I suppose we'll have to see whether people like, the people who are trying their best, people like Neil Lawson and Mainstream and Clive Lewis, whether they can somehow revive this zombie Frankenstein monster that they've built. I don't have a huge amount of hope they're going to succeed, but best luck to them.
Paul Holden, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Well, in the last 20 months, Keir Starmer has been attacked by the opposition, the public, his own members, his own MPs, and even the leader of Scottish Labour, Anna Sarwar. This latest development in the Mandelson saga, however, seems to have lost the last of the bastions of Starmer's loyal foot soldiers, the compliant centrist media darlings who treated him as an antidote to Tory chaos and ignored all of the left's evidence of his corruption and dishonesty. Journalist Otto English, for example, famously tweeted out the now pilloried sentence, "It's nice, isn't it, the quiet," upon Starmer assuming office, now comparing the current scandal to something from satirical comedy Yes Minister. But if there's one man who consistently stuck his neck for brave Sir Keir time and time again, both in the run-up to the election and in the months of scandal and chaos that followed it, it is the king of the sensibles, James O'Brien. He calls himself a sensible, by the way. Now, even O'Brien has to concede that there is essentially no defence left for the beleaguered Prime Minister.
It was almost the only thing left in Keir Starmer's locker that you thought you could rely on. His commitment to and observance of process. The idea when we engaged in muted celebration that 14 years of nation-shredding government appeared to be in retreat, the idea that this would signal a period not of perfection, but of at least an end to the kind of corruption, the perception of corruption, the dishonesty, the perceptions of dishonesty, the ludicrous finagling and reverse ferreting and excusing and explaining, just the simple idea perhaps in retrospect naive, that we would go back to a system where things were mostly transparent and largely dealt with honestly. I feel profoundly let down on this particular issue because it's really hard to see any justification for what has happened.
I sound so deflated and pathetic. It's really quite funny. But like when he's out here saying, oh, well, you thought that he would just be this bastion of honesty and we'd get rid of all of the dishonesty. We told you. We told you, James. We continually told you about all the lies, all the broken pledges, just even lies about even like basic stuff that you didn't even need to lie about, like him pretending that he'd never called Jeremy Corbyn a friend as well as a colleague, things that were on video. So many things just on video, positions that he held before that not only did he not hold now, he claimed that he never held to begin with, that just get rewritten by his time being Labour leader. It was so obvious to anyone paying like even a small amount of attention that this man continually engaged in dishonesty, but not dishonesty it kind of opportunistically. It was a project built upon subterfuge. It was a project built upon dishonesty from the beginning. And it was constantly relayed over and over and over again on this show, on my personal show, the left more broadly, on social media, whether it be on TikTok or Twitter or on YouTube. Plenty of creators on the left were putting forward the case for Keir Starmer's consistent pattern of dishonesty. But of course, it was totally gone completely unnoticed by people like James O'Brien, who continue to have this facsimile of Keir Starmer in their head as somebody who was going to be an actual statesman, based purely, from what I can see, based upon vibes. Now, what I will say, though, is this next clip, it's a kind of a rare moment of introspection from James.
Reasons why I don't want him to resign would include the fear of chaos, the fact that there's a war on that he's handling exceptionally well, the fact that I can't quite see anything happening in the immediate aftermath of Keir Starmer's resignation that would be better for the country in many ways than Keir Starmer staying in Downing Street. That's not the biggest of my concerns, by the way, because there are 2 or 3 people who could quite quickly prove that they would be better prime ministers than him. But these are reasons why I don't want him to go. Reasons why I do want him to go, I think the first is actually patriotism. The first reason why I want Keir Starmer to go is that we have to be better than this. And just because I honestly and almost passionately thought that he would be, is not enough to dial down the anger and the upset that this is a situation the likes of which you expected to see under Boris Johnson, not under Keir Starmer. What is happening now is that the man who came into power promising a new era of transparency and due process has appointed to the role of the most senior British diplomat on the planet a man who had failed a security vetting process, and I'm not sure it matters whether he knew or not.
Like, it's interesting because I didn't expect him to even make the comparison that I've been making for a while now, which is that there's so many similarities between Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson. And it's really exemplified by this latest scandal and broadly the Peter Mandelson scandal from the beginning, where it was the denial, the backing of the people, create fall guys, continual fall guy again and again and again, right? Remember Operation Save Big Dog? Under Boris Johnson, when it was clear that at the very least Johnson was somewhat culpable in poor things happening through lack of judgment or not following the right processes and continually finding somebody else to be the scapegoat who would end up taking the blame. Obviously, the lies are something that were kind of emblematic of Boris Johnson being in government. Right. The difference, I think, though, is that when it came to Boris Johnson, I felt like he lied opportunistically. It was just, I'm in deep shit because I've acted like a moron, so I've got to find some way of doing it. So they hurriedly find some ulterior narrative and a lie that they can tell, like a white lie to tell to ensure that Boris Johnson is saved in the name of the project that the Tory party had to make sure that he didn't have to resign. But when it came to Keir Starmer, the problem was so much more insidious, right? Like, as I mentioned before, his penchant for deception and subterfuge has been well documented. And James himself actively resisted this information and even admitted to doing so when being asked to consider the risks of giving Starmer the level of power that he has, given his large majority in the Commons. This is what James said before the election.
So I am supposed to be worried about a massive majority for the Labour Party. And because I am a sensible, I have allowed this to seep into my thinking. Sometimes a form of political osmosis takes place, even for those of us that pride ourselves on being, or like to pride ourselves on being evidence-based or being, fact-driven rather than feeling-driven. Sometimes I think the chatter gets so loud or the consensus becomes so clear that you almost get infected by it. So I have found myself, when I was touring the book, I was asked a few times about this, and I found myself nodding, stroking my beard, is the phrase I want. Not literally, actually I probably did it literally. Stroking my beard and trying to say something sensible. They're very important to say. I'd like to say something sensible. And if you're searching for something sensible to say, you say, well, I do worry about the lack of accountability that would be contingent upon a massive Labour majority. And I said it for 2 or 3 months of the book tour. And then I got asked it again, and I paused. And I found myself thinking, well, hang on a minute. You haven't actually thought this through. You're just repeating what you think is sensible because it sounds so sensible. Why should I be worried about a Labour Party having a majority even bigger than Boris Johnson's? I don't think, for all his faults, nobody thinks that Keir Starmer is a proven, morally corrupt serial liar. He might flip-flop a bit, and you could accuse him of breaking promises made in pursuit of the Labour leadership that he is not intending to keep once he's secured it. But that's politics. Johnson's level of lying. Imagine how big a lie you have to be to get kicked out by a Brexit party, by a Tory Brexit party. How big a liar do you have to be to get chucked out by a party whose entire electoral mandate is built on lies? Answer, very big liar.
It's the most quintessential James O'Brien clip, this, Stephen, because he even says himself, oh, well, he lied to the Labour membership, but they don't matter. It doesn't matter if he lied to Labour membership. That's just politics. Lying to the country like Boris Johnson did over, being ambushed by a cake. Oh no, this is the biggest liar, a ginormous, massive liar because of the things that they were doing around Brexit. What it really does show the reality of how he got to this position is that when it came to the people who were criticising with numerous pieces of evidence that Keir Starmer was a liar, who built his position on deliberate subterfuge, unlike Boris Johnson, as I said, who I think was doing it opportunistically. And they were those critiques coming from the left. They were coming from people James O'Brien, as far as I can see, perceives to be beneath him, to the point at which he even dismissed those concerns as just being politics and that clear. But do you think I'm on the right ballpark here?
No, I think you're totally on the right ballpark. And I think the dismissal of those complaints from the left isn't because they're from the left. It's because they perturb a kind of fantasy that liberals are permanently in. So liberals are just permanently in this, have this idea that things are sort of fine as they are, so long as we sort of just have a good man in charge, a morally upstanding man in charge. And it doesn't really matter whether it's a Tory or a Labour person, so long as they keep things roughly as they are and they don't embarrass us by publicly appearing to do the kinds of dishonesty and skullduggery that's often required by politics. And why they hate the left is because the left perturbs their fantasy that everything is all right. The left is concerned, they have a sort of, the sense to know that, for example, the poor will always be with us, the sick will always be with us, this kind of Victorian idea of it being a kind of necessity that such people exist. Whereas the left, of course, thinks, no, that's a structural issue. That's an issue which allows you to be comfortable and you to think that everything is all right, but which, determines that necessarily such people will have to exist, and that's what we want to tackle. And so, when there is just no way for someone like James O'Brien to recognize that what Starmer did during the collapse of Corbynism and how he treated Corbyn and how he conducted himself once he became leader, there's no way for him to recognize that as a form of dishonesty, because actually what he sees is a man who's going to serve his narrow interests as a wealthy person with a sort of liberal aesthetic about politics. So I don't think he discarded these objections coming from the left. I think he just fundamentally could not see them as true when he looked at Keir Starmer, because Keir Starmer is that ideal for someone who lives in the liberal fantasy that I've just described. And nor could he recognize, even while Starmer was doing terrible things as Prime Minister, that he was doing terrible things as Prime Minister. I mean, you can talk about the fuel allowance, the benefits cap. You can talk about other things like, I mean, one of the things that I think is one of the worst things that they've done is the prescription of Palestine action, because what they've in fact done is they've used the terror law in such a way that they've set a precedent just before a reform government is likely to get in, that it's okay for the government to use that architecture to prescribe groups that they don't like or that their allies don't like.
Very Trumpian style.
Very Trumpian, exactly. And none of that would have been objectionable to James O'Brien. I don't know. Maybe I've got that wrong. Maybe he's been at some of these Defend Our Juries protests. I don't know. I've got no idea. Maybe.
I understand where you're coming from. And I think lots of that certainly is true, especially when it comes to not recognising the failures in terms of policy when they're in government. But I genuinely do think in the run-up to the election, the biggest driver here, because I saw it from so many members of the commentariat, was because obviously the Labour Together project, it wasn't just to get rid of the left from the Labour Party, it was to delegitimise the left as a political force entirely. Like, these people are not just bad, right? They're not just people we disagree with. They're not just people who don't fit the Labour Party mould, who shouldn't be part of this political movement. These are people who are beneath contempt. These are people who are anti-Semites, they're cranks, they are intraists, they are people who didn't have to be removed from Labour because they didn't fit an ideological prescription. They were removed from the Labour Party because they were bad people. It was wrong to have them in any political party. They had to be removed, which is why we're seeing this whole, the anti-Semites are joining the Green Party now, purely, most of the time, on having criticism of Israel. And I think that because there was this deliberate strategy from the Labour right, which journalists bought into, journalists were meeting with Morgan McSweeney whilst all this stuff was happening in the background from 2017 to 2019, right? People from the Anushka Asthana article where she talked about what Morgan McSweeney was talking about, the project for Labour Together. And because that narrative had been pushed about the people who were part of the Corbyn movement during that period, lots of the centrist journalists who have an innate trust, as you say, of these liberal figures who represent their politics. They couldn't interrogate claims that the left were what one of my favorite accounts on Twitter would call the unwanted pig people. They would just go, oh, clearly these people are not people they need to pay attention to.
But that's just the flip side of what I said about Starmer, is that so they couldn't see Starmer's dishonesty, they couldn't see his mendaciousness, and the mendaciousness of that whole project, because they're so blinded by the kind of this sort of moral aesthetic, which also happens, conveniently to represent their economic interests. And the flip side of that is that they couldn't interrogate they couldn't for a minute think that those claims might be false. Because they were coming from that project of, the man with the nice haircut.
That's what it's put it brought down to half the time. They call these people the briefcase wing of the party sometimes, because so much is aesthetic and vibes.
Yeah, totally. And honestly, when James O'Brien described him there as someone who preferred facts, not feelings, like, these people only have feelings. They don't care about facts, and they don't see half the facts that are around them because their feelings get in the way, obscure them completely from view.
True. I absolutely have to say, if there's one group of people who are the most guilty of putting feelings over facts, it is the centrist liberal commentariat. Iran has declared that the Strait of Hormuz is now completely open to commercial traffic and will remain open until the end of the current ceasefire. In a post online, the country's foreign minister said this: in line with the ceasefire in Lebanon, the passage of all commercial vessels through the Strait of Hormuz is declared completely open for the remaining period of the ceasefire on the coordinated route as already announced by Ports and Maritime Organization of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Soon after that announcement, the price of Brent crude oil dropped by 10% to below $90 a barrel. That's the lowest it's been in over a month, but still about 20% higher than before the illegal war in Iran started at the end of February. Now, Raji's post refers to a coordinated route, so the strait is not completely open. Before the United States and Israel launched their illegal attack on Iran, maritime traffic passing through the strait used two deep channels lying close to the Omani side of the passage. Since then, the few ships that have passed through have been directed closer to Iran coastline, using a shallow channel close to Larak Island. That's the route that shipping analysts believe Araghchi is referring to in his post. So getting things moving again may take some time. In his post, Araghchi also says Iran has only committed to keeping the strait open until the end of the ceasefire, which is just 5 days away. That was swiftly contradicted by US President Donald Trump, however, who posted this: Iran has agreed to never close the Strait of Hormuz again. It will no longer be used as a weapon against the world. President Donald J. Trump. Trump also posted this: The Strait of Hormuz is completely open and ready for business and full passage, but the naval blockade will remain in full force and effect as it pertains to Iran only until such time as our transaction with Iran is 100% complete. This process should go very quickly and that most of the points are already negotiated. Thank you for your attention to this matter, President Donald J. Trump. So, Trump seems fairly confident of quickly reaching a permanent deal, but what are the points that have already been agreed? A ceasefire in Lebanon was, according to Iranian officials, always a necessity for progress, and now they've got that, and more on how they got that in a minute. But what has Trump got? The strait is open, but there's disagreement over how long that will last. And on Thursday night, the president said this.
The big thing we have to do is we have to make sure that Iran does not have a nuclear weapon, because if they do, you want to talk about problems, you'd have problems. So very important is that Iran does not have a nuclear weapon, and they've agreed to that. Iran's agreed to that, and they've agreed to it very powerfully. They've agreed to give us back the nuclear dust that's way underground because of the attack we made with the B-2 bomber. So we have a lot of agreement with Iran, and I think something's going to happen very positive.
Now, Iran has long said it's not pursuing a nuclear weapon. Indeed, the now killed Ayatollah Ali Khamenei issued a fatwa against such weapons in the mid-90s. But when Trump refers to Iran's nuclear dust, he means Iran's 660 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium presumed buried deep underground at the country's enrichment facility in Isfahan. Axios has also published further details of potential agreement around that nuclear dust, corroborated by two sources, involving cash for uranium, and they say this. According to two sources, the US was ready in an earlier stage of the negotiations to release $6 billion for Iran to purchase food, medicine, and other humanitarian supplies. The Iranians demanded $27 billion. The latest number discussed by the United States and Iran is $20 billion, other sources said. One US official said that it was a US proposal. The other US official described the cash for uranium concept as one of many discussions. Meanwhile, the US asked Iran to agree to ship all its nuclear material to the United States, while the Iranians only agreed to downblend it inside Iran. Under a compromise proposal now under discussion, some of the highly enriched uranium would be shipped to a third country, not necessarily the United States, and some of it would be downblended in Iran under international monitoring. There is also alleged to be an ongoing discussion over a voluntary moratorium on nuclear enrichment by Iran, with the article saying this. The US demanded in the last round of talks that Iran agree to a 20-year moratorium. Iran countered with 5 years. The mediators are still trying to close the gap. Iran would be allowed to have nuclear research reactors for the production of medical isotopes, but would pledge that all of its nuclear facilities would be above ground. The existing underground facilities would remain out of commission. This seems to be a pretty big win for the Trump administration, potentially, given how much of a hole they had dug themselves into thus far.
All of this is also, happening within the window of the ceasefire, where they're not negotiating, but they're going to get back to the table probably this weekend, actually, although there's been no movement so far. But that's what, all the buzz is that it's going to be this weekend. I think there is, the strait being opened, it could be a win for Trump. It might not, because it might sort of be immediately closed again if things don't go Iran's way. It could be a very, very useful piece of leverage. Trump has obviously put this blockade in place of the port. Presumably that blockade is not going to stay there if war starts up again, because then, there's going to be missile strikes on it. So it'll move away then. These two movements around the strait, I don't think of as being particularly indicative of what else is going on. It's, and it's often the case in negotiations that you do make gestures of goodwill. You do say, okay, well, I'll do this, or, I did promise at the beginning, which Trump has said, that, Iran had said it would reopen the strait during the ceasefire, and they didn't do it because they also believed that Lebanon was a part of the ceasefire. Now that Lebanon has a ceasefire, they've opened the strait. So that seems to me that it could just be that part of the logic.
It's certainly a show of good faith. It does seem.
Certainly, yeah, it's exactly. Yeah, exactly. On the other things, I mean, there are some issues here for that Trump has staked his entire sort of reason for the war on. I mean, the reasons for the war have changed a lot over the course of the war, the stated reasons for the war. But anyway, what he wants out of the ceasefire, the red line, is no nuclear bomb and no enriched uranium, at least for some period of time. as you said, Iran has always said it doesn't want a nuclear weapon. It's not producing. It's not trying to produce one. On the uranium, I think that is probably somewhere where they're going to budge. And as I've said before a number of times, that really what Trump needs more than anything is a deal that doesn't look like the Obama deal. It just has to be a tiny bit different from the Obama deal for him to be able to say, I've done a better job. It was all worth it. It was all worth it. That stupid deal that I tore up.
A terrible deal, such a bad deal.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, I love when you do that. Yeah, that's all he needs. And I think the Iranians must know this, that fundamentally that's ultimately where the negotiations are going to end up, somewhere where they give some kind of moratorium on uranium production. I think this idea of what the plan that they might have for the current uranium, like watering some of it down, we already offered that back in February, that they would water down the uranium, getting some of it to a third country. I can imagine that might be palatable if the moratorium terms are right. But the funniest thing, I think, is the money. Like, Trump is supposed to be like Trump's field of expertise, really being a hard negotiator over the dollars. But they started with a $6 billion offer. Iran countered with 27. Now they're at 20. I'm not a maths expert, but that's a lot closer to 27 than it is to 6, isn't it?
And also, this is all money on top of all of the billions that they've incinerated on this war. Money that I'm sure most MAGA voters would have wanted to have spent on America.
Now, I think that's not right, because I think this will not be US money. This will be unlocked sanctions money, unlocked money that has been sanctioned and put away. This is the amount that they'll agree to unlock. but I wouldn't be surprised if I think Iran will hold out. For each year of moratorium, presumably you'd want an exchange that involved a great deal more of that money being unlocked. You want a program, much like the last deal, a program whereby your right to enrich loosens up, you're allowed to do more, as does the amount of money that comes out of sanctions, depending on what the inspections yield. I wouldn't really be that surprised if there's a deal soon. I don't think either side want to go back to war. I think there is a deal that they're able to get, which will be not a million, won't be a million years different from the one that was last in place, but it will be different enough for Trump to be able to say that he won a victory. And I think that probably could be done quite quickly.
I think the Iranians are not stupid. They know exactly what makes Trump tick. They know exactly how to work this man, clearly, in terms of what they know that they need to do to get the deal favourable in their interests based upon what Trump wants to gain from this, right? There is a possibility where, even though obviously people have lost lots already from what's happened, insofar as, given what the worst prescriptions could be, that both Iran and Trump gain more than they lose in the terms of how this ceasefire draws out. I think what's clear to me is that there is going to be someone who probably will end up losing more than what they expected, and that's Israel.
Yes.
Speaking of which, now I want to ask you a little actually about the timing of the opening of the Strait as well. On top of this, it was announced just as representatives from dozens of countries were set to meet in Paris for a summit on the forming of a maritime force to open the Strait. This was led by French President Emmanuel Macron and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. The US was deliberately excluded from the meeting. Why? Well, because, as Macron put it, any force would operate strictly defensively, which I suppose means defending ships trying to pass through the Straits. That meant belligerents would have to be excluded. Shortly after the Strait was reopened, Trump posted this online. Now that the Hormuz Strait situation is over, I received a call from NATO asking if we would need some help. I told them to stay away unless they just want to load up their ships with oil. They will use us when needed. A paper tiger, President DJT. Stephen, has Trump taken the wind out of Europe's sails here?
Do you know, I'm quite a petty person. I'm quite proud of being petty. I quite enjoy it. And I recognize it when I see it. In Trump, this was a masterclass in pettiness, a masterclass in thinking like, okay, how can I score some extra, or how can I inflict a little bit of extra humiliation or misery on the group of countries that has let me down? And in that, he includes Starmer, he includes Macron, he includes Meloni, who was there in person in Paris today as well. Some of the other countries were joining online. And yeah, I thought it was it was just before they started their meeting, to discuss this, Europe force or whatever. And he achieved something. He did something. He opened the Strait of Hormuz while they were all logging into their Zoom calls.
Well, it's funny though. I think that whilst obviously Trump wants to get one over on Europe, I think Europe's going to be looking at this and going, "Oh yeah, good. You got us, DJT. At the end of the day, we need our oil, we need our fertilizer, we need our CO2."
Of course, it doesn't. It's great. If it stays open, it offsets many of the problems that they were trying to commit to some kind of force to try and resolve. But it does puncture the sort of it's definitely there in Keir Starmer. It's definitely there in Macron. The sort of I'm leading the side of, this is, again, this kind of puffed up, I'm the moral compass sort of.
With the adults in the room, with the sensibles.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't mind seeing that. The trouble is that Trump can't really be properly petty because he always has to brag about it. He always has to reveal it. Whereas, a really petty person just does it and then let's sit with it. But he's got to be tweet this thing or
bombastic.
Put this truth social, but bombastic, talk about NATO begging him if they can now get involved now that it's been done. I think by NATO, he just means these countries. So yeah. Anyway, I enjoyed it.
That's true. I know, obviously, we mentioned before about Israel, what they're getting out of this. Well, let's talk about the Lebanon ceasefire. Those were scenes of celebration on the streets of Sidon in southern Lebanon, as the city's residents returned to the city as the ceasefire in the war in Israel came into effect on Thursday night. And they weren't alone. That was Beirut, where fireworks and gunfire lit up the night sky as the ceasefire began. And long tailbacks have formed on the country's main coastal highway to the south, as many as a million displaced people start making their way to what's left of their homes, if of course anything. Israel's depopulation and destruction of towns in the south has been comprehensive, to say the least. Thousands of buildings have been completely leveled, with many, many more likely to be damaged beyond habitability. That was a deliberate strategy of Israel's defense minister, Israel Katz, who instructed the military to, quote, accelerate the destruction of Lebanese homes near the Israeli border based on the model in Gaza. That's the Dahiyya doctrine that Dali was talking about before. According to international law, the systematic leveling of countless homes may amount to a war crime. The ceasefire was signed between Israel and the government of Lebanon, not Hezbollah, the other combatant force in the war. The ceasefire document provided by the US State Department described the agreement as, quote, a gesture of goodwill by the government of Israel. It will last for 10 days, and here are some of its terms. Israel retains its right to take all necessary measures in self-defense at any time against planned, imminent, or ongoing attacks. Lebanon must take meaningful steps to prevent Hezbollah and other rogue non-state armed groups from carrying out attacks against Israeli targets. Those involved recognize that Lebanon security forces have exclusive responsibility for Lebanon security, and Israel and Lebanon have requested that the US continues to facilitate further direct talks with the objective of resolving all remaining issues. So far, despite Hezbollah not being a signatory to it, the peace has held. That's unusual for ceasefires signed by Israel. But a post by US President Donald Trump outlining some potential agreement on the Iran ceasefire deal may explain why. The USA will get all nuclear dust created by our great B-2 bombers. No money will exchange hands in any way, shape, or form. This deal is in no way subject to Lebanon either, but the USA will separately work with Lebanon and deal with the Hezbollah situation in an appropriate manner. Israel will not be bombing Lebanon any longer. They are prohibited from doing so by the USA. Enough is enough. Thank you, President DJT. Trump's prohibition is also backed up by some of the Israeli press. According to them, the ceasefire took the entire Israeli government by surprise. This is from the Times of Israel. Trump made the initial ceasefire announcement on social media shortly after wrapping up a phone call with Netanyahu, during which he coaxed the Israeli premier to agree to the truce. The news caught Israel's security cabinet off guard, as no meeting was held to approve the decision beforehand, and prompted furious condemnation from mayors in northern Israel who said the government had failed to ensure the security of their residents and warned that Israel was losing the north. Coaxed is one word for it, and opposition politicians are trying to make hay. Former Israeli military chief of staff and head of the Center Yashar party, Gadi Eisenkot, told the BBC this. A ceasefire must come from a position of strength in order to service the national interests of Israel. A pattern has developed in which ceasefires are imposed upon us in Gaza, in Iran, and now in Lebanon. Netanyahu does not know how to convert military achievements into diplomatic gains. Ceasefire may also put Netanyahu in a tough spot with the electorate. A recent polling of Israelis showed that amongst Jewish voters, 80% were either certain or thought Israel that should continue with its war with Hezbollah. Amongst Arab citizens, 66% were either certain or thought it should not. There are around 4 times as many Jewish Israelis as Arab Israelis. To reassure that population, Netanyahu uploaded a video minutes before Trump announced that the US was prohibiting Israel from doing any more attacks. In it, he stated that Israel was not done yet with Hezbollah and that he had agreed to a temporary ceasefire in Lebanon at the request of Trump. The ceasefire, he said, gave Israel the opportunity to promote a combined political and military solution with the Lebanese government. But Netanyahu also described the deal as one hand holding a weapon, while the other hand is extending in peace. Stephen, now, obviously the word that we used there was coaxed in terms of getting a ceasefire agreement, but given the fact that the Security Council in Israel not consulted about this, it was directly coming as a diktat from the Trump campaign, it shows what we've always been saying from day one. US president, in any case, in terms of actions by Israel, they hold a kill switch. They hold a kill switch, and they always have when it came to Gaza, when it came to Lebanon, when it came to Iran, when it came to all of this. Biden and now Trump, at any time, all they had to say was no, and the bombing would stop. Doesn't this prove that we were right?
Of course you were. I mean, we didn't need the proof, but yes, it certainly does prove that we were right. But it also shows something else about when a US president will use it, what kind of corner they have to be boxed into in order to do it, right? So we know that last week when Israel, in 10 minutes killed over 350 people, injured hundreds more by dropping bombs all over Beirut and other parts of the country. That was just after the ceasefire had been agreed. And we know that Trump was furious and that there was a phone call made to Netanyahu. So why was he so angry? Well, he was so angry because there was a great political risk for him at that point. He had just established a ceasefire, which Israel was clearly trying to scupper at that point. Again, the question of Lebanon has been such a central part for Iran of proceeding with the ceasefire. Obviously, it came to a point where, it was clear that Netanyahu wasn't going to do it. I mean, Trump had said yesterday, I believe, that there was going to be a ceasefire. Netanyahu denied it, met with his security cabinet last night, and then it was agreed that there wouldn't be one, or maybe that was the night before, sorry. It was agreed that there wouldn't be one. And then Trump made the phone call and said, yeah, there's absolutely going to be a ceasefire, and you are going to stick to it. And it's because the cost for him of there not being one are so high, because he will lose in those negotiations with Iran. He will not be able to achieve any of the things he set out to achieve, and then he will have to go back to war, and that will lose him his base even harder than it's lost him already. So, and by the way, nobody boxed Trump into that corner except for himself and potentially Israel, who sort of helped him along the way to doing this war on Iran. But it shows you what needs to be in place in order for US presidents to push the button. And that tells you something about what they actually care about, which is that they don't care about Palestinians being killed, or they don't care about Palestinians being thrown off their lands or being legally and socially discriminated against. They don't care about the killing of Lebanese people in South Lebanon, the destruction of all of their homes. They don't care about any of that. The only time they'll instruct Israel to do anything when something like that is happening is when it coordinates with their own political futures. And that's why the pro-Palestinian movement growing in America, the deep suspicion of Israeli money and Israeli interference growing in America, this is all very, very important for changing how presidents respond to Israel in the future. And actually, because Trump has done it, it kind of sets a precedent, the possibility of doing it, which I think is going to be really, really important. I mean, what we'll have to see is whether Israel abides by this ceasefire. I mean, Israel goes through ceasefires like tissues. It's not in their habit to abide by a ceasefire. It's in their habit to kill as many people just before the ceasefire comes into place and then slowly degrade it over time until it's just no longer.
It's worth pointing out, right, that there's a ceasefire in Gaza. They have been continually killing people in Gaza this whole time.
Kill people constantly. So whether it holds will be the real test of this. And also whether Hezbollah is going to be able to respect a ceasefire that they're not a signatory to. That's another test of it. I mean, there are Hezbollah politicians in the Lebanese parliament. In fact, I think there are 2 in the cabinet. So maybe they're holding, there is some political communication that's happening between the Lebanese government and the armed wing of Hezbollah. But I will tell you that Lebanese people who've been forced out of South Lebanon, who are now returning to flattened homes and dead relatives, and as we saw on the show last night, not being able to bury their loved ones who were killed in strikes. And this is not going to create a scenario where there's an amenable sense of peace. I mean, everyone is desperate. Lebanese people would love for there to be peace, but they also need to trust that it's going to remain. And they won't want to see Hezbollah disarmed until it's very, very clear that it is going to remain. So the disarming of Hezbollah as a condition for the peace seems to me an unlikely and difficult thing to carry out.
I agree. I think there probably will be a lot of difficulty there. But I think that there's a really important point that you made about the pro-Palestinian movement in America being as strong as it is, essentially being able to see, with the precedent that we have now, to be able to twist the arm of future administrations to, even if they don't want to break with Israel, at least be more likely to be able to rein Israel in. But I think when it comes to the funding as well, is that you looked at when they started the genocide in Gaza, in the first kind of few weeks of the invasion, when they started putting tanks on the ground in Gaza, they were almost immediately at risk of running out of munitions, running out of military hardware, running out of the resources they needed to continue prosecuting the genocide. And it was only the continual, kind of rabbit feed conveyor belt of munitions headed from the Biden administration that they were able to prosecute the genocide continually in the way that they were. They would have immediately just got burnt through all of their stockpiles and had nothing left were it not for continual flows of US aid. So I think the key fulcrum here, on top of the political point that we're making with being more harsh, engaging in the kind of forcefulness that Menachem Begin engaged in all those years ago in the 1980s, it is the fundamental part of this is the money. The fundamental part of this, I think, really is going to be, can they continue to sustain a political consensus in America where they're happy to send money to Israel? So people like Chuck Schumer, who even the opposition can't even oppose the war properly, but also cannot even oppose the arms sales to Israel, that's going to be the real sticking point in terms of US Congress and US representatives in how this relationship is mediated.
I'm not so sure, because I think that nothing has changed geopolitically that doesn't make Israel still an incredibly important client state for the US, kind of, everyone loves talking about like Iran's proxies and whatever, a proxy state in the Middle East. And in order to maintain the proxy nature of that state, it will have to continue to arm it. It will have to continue to fund it. But the real question for the suspicion growing amongst voters in the US and for the pro-Palestinian movement, people who are part of it, but even people who aren't part of that movement, but who are, deeply offended by AIPAC or deeply offended by the fact that their tax money continues to fund a war machine in the Middle East, will be the extent to which the US, the president or the government of the US can constrain and will constrain Israel. If I think that those voters won't care that much that money and arms are going to Israel, so long as Israel is not using them to do things that they find objectionable.
I can understand that. I can definitely understand that position. Anyway, thank you very much, Stephen, for joining me this evening.
Thanks, Helena. I'm really glad it's the weekend.
Absolutely, me too. Honestly, the rigmarole of today's show. I mean, it's definitely been fun to go through, certainly. And I want to thank again Paul Holden for joining us tonight, as his insights, as always, incredibly invaluable on that top story.
Yeah, totally.
Absolutely. Well, as always, thank you everyone for tuning in at home as well. Come back tomorrow, or come back on Monday even, for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.